I promise, I know I've been away from music for a very long while, so we will be, touring again next year and releasing music again next year. But in the spirit of that, before all that, I've come to talk to you today about a book I wrote. Can't believe it's gone so quickly. 8 years ago now, in 2018, I wrote a book called Natives: Race and Class in the Ruins of Empire. And I'm going to try. Thank you. Seems a couple of people have read it, so. For those who haven't, there'll be a few spoilers in here, but I just want to talk you through some of the ideas and some of the concepts in the book and try and get through the overview of that and kind of, I suppose, what I think has happened as it pertains to these issues in the 8 years since a little bit. So, first of all, a definition of terms. Race, because often we use terms in life and we think we mean the same thing, often we mean something very, very different. Race is often confused for ethnicity, for example, right? We think that all human bigotry can come under racism, but ethnic bigotry has probably always existed and probably always will exist. What do I mean when I say that? Ethnic groups do exist. People have languages, they have cultures, they come from particular regions of the world. Ethnic groups are real entities, in a sense. Racial groups are not. We know from genetic science there is more genetic variation within Africa, because of the out of Africa evolution of humanity, than there is between the entire rest of the world combined. I.e., a person from Nigeria and a person from the Congo are more genetically different from each other than a person from Sweden and a person from China. As strange as that may seem, and as odd as that may seem, geneticists will confirm that for you. In fact, even more interestingly, I was watching a video the other day by a genetic scientist who was talking about the fact that two people in the Kalahari Desert next to each other, who on the surface look relatively similar, are actually, when you look at their DNA, when you look at their genes, are more genetically different from each other than a person from Sweden and a person from China. Right, so race is fiction, race is myth. Ethnicity is real, does exist because people belong to cultures and ethnic groups. And I suppose the difference between racism and ethnic prejudice is that racism claimed, and in some circles is still claiming, to be based on scientific truth. Even though it's a complete myth, it makes the claim that there are permanent, hierarchical categories between human beings, and that these reflect moral, intellectual worth, and they are permanent and biological and unalterable. So race is unique in that way. It actually comes out, the first time the word race was used in Western languages, came out of France, and it was to do with the breeding of dogs. It was nothing to do with human beings. Right? So racism in itself is a scientific myth that claims there are permanent, hierarchical, biological categories between human beings. Class is in a sense also real, which is not to say that people who have wealth and power and status are better than people who lack those things, but class is real, it exists in the world. It isn't just about some people having money and some people not having money, it's about people's relationship to the means of production, relationship to the state, and it affects the way you're educated, it affects the way you are treated by the courts of law, it affects many, many things in your life in a very, very real way. You'll see in this talk I try to unpack some of the ways both race and class impacted my life, not just to tell my own personal story, but to show that actually these are ideas, these are real things that govern part of the way we live in the world. Empire, imperialism, colonial empires. What's interesting when you look throughout history, even before modern European empires, if you look at the ancient Roman Empire or beyond, every single empire in human history has some sort of self-righteous justification, right, about why its empire was so moral and it was so wonderful and it was bringing, civilization to the barbarians, and it had some higher justification for its own version of colonialism. Of course, nobody ever wants to be conquered themselves, because everyone understands that nobody really conquers any other group because they love them so much and they want them to have democracy and human rights. Conquest is almost always invariably about stealing labor, i.e. slavery or forced labor, stealing land and stealing resources. Yeah, so imperialism relates to the first two categories, and through empire we get what I would call racial capitalism, right? In the modern world, capitalism evolved in step with colonialism. Not necessarily in and of itself, that private ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange necessarily results in racism, but because capitalism involved hand in hand with colonialism, we have a world that I would argue in many ways is governed by racial capitalism. And it is actually easy to forget, just a century ago, that almost the entire world, a good portion of the world, was a formal colony of one or other country of Western Europe, very, very recently, in our great-grandparents' lifetime. So race, class, and empire, the things that I try to examine in the book. I open with a chapter called Born in the 80s. I know that makes me not that young anymore, which I'm struggling to accept, but the grey hairs are telling their own story, and the Janet Jackson mic is also telling its own story. And the reason why the Janet Jackson mic is telling its own story, because the fact that I call it a Janet Jackson mic, and all of you who are over the age of 35 laughed, means that it's a reference point to a time period that we share. But I use this image to represent the 80s. This is an image from the Broadwater Farm riots or uprisings, depending on your perspective. And the 80s, one of the central arguments I make in the book is that the decade I was born in the 80s and the time period we're in now seem to me like a sort of, almost like a Groundhog Day, a cycle of the same issues. Issues we perhaps thought we'd defeated in the 90s and the noughties when it appeared we'd become a flawed but kind of confident multicultural society, and a lot of that over the preceding 15 years of society decline. It feels like a rerun of the 80s for those of us that were there. So what was happening in the 80s? This image here comes out of the Broadwater Farm riots in which a policeman was killed, but those riots actually began because of a police raid on a home of a woman called Cynthia Jarrett, who then died very, very suspiciously, to put it mildly, in police custody. And it was 2 weeks apart from the Brixton riots, in which a woman called Sherry Gross was shot in the back and paralysed. Again, this seems crazy today because in many ways, obviously, policing is still leaves a lot to be desired in this country, and there are huge problems. And of course, we've had the Wayne Cousinses of this world, so we know that police abusing women is something that still happens. But the police shooting someone's grandmother in the back is something that isn't a frequent occurrence, thankfully. But it's interesting because, relating to issues of today, if we were to go back to the media at the time, you'd see that these riots were portrayed in a particular way, and the communities engaged in them were portrayed in a particular way. But the police officers, who in one case shot someone in the back, in one case caused someone else's grandmother to have a heart attack, were not presented in a particular way. And I mean, if there's ever a reason to be angry and to rebel against the state, I think your grandmother being killed or being paralysed might be the reason. But the 1980s was a very, very tumultuous decade, very, very challenging decade, and I try to explain some of that. For me personally, someone who was born in a single-parent family, working class, uncles went to prison, many, many stereotypical things on the face of it, I try to also outline why I think I've ended up being the one here speaking to you today, because you know how the system works, right? If you come from a particular type of background and you're successful, you're encouraged to believe that you're successful because you're so individually exceptional. I made it, why can't all you people just do the same thing I did? And I don't believe in that view of the world. I'm not saying that my own personal choices make no difference to my life outcomes. That would be absurd. What I am saying is, even though on paper I have a free school meal, single parent family, uncles in prison, I was also very, very fortunate. My stepdad, who wasn't a very well-off man, was the stage manager of this beautiful place, the Hackney Empire, one of the only working-class African-Caribbean-led theatres in London. My godfather is still the stage manager of this place here. I probably saw, thank you. Shout out to my boss. I probably saw more theatre with an F, obviously, growing up than most rich children see. Right, so I had a certain sense, even though we grew up, economically poor, we grew up culturally very rich, and that meant I had a certain sense of entitlement that many, many working class kids, even working class white children, are not taught to have. I had this Caribbean immigrant arrogance almost, where a lot of my elders, even if they made difficult decisions in their own life, were very, very militantly pro-education, which we'll come back to soon as well. I'm going to race through some of the slides, right? This is a guide to denial, because when we think about why people say stuff like, I don't see colour, right? Obviously it's an absurd thing to say. We all see colour, right? And I remember this from Sean when he said, what you do in traffic light. But I think it speaks to the difficulty and the challenges we have, discussing difficult issues. For me, of course, it's not about whether people see colour. Everybody sees colour who's lucky enough not to be colourblind. It's about the values people do and don't attach to other people's humanity based on colour that I suppose is the issue we're trying to unpick here. We've got a chapter in the book called The Day I Realised My Mum Was White, and believe it or not, it was actually a day, a very particular day. I had no idea my mum was white and I was black, and that was what society thought of the world, thought of myself in the world. And I was just moseying along, having a relationship with my mum, and I go to school one day. I'm very sorry, I'm about to swear, so if there's any parents that want to cover their children's ears, that's fine. But I went to school one day. If you've read the book, you'll know what I'm about to say. And a boy in school, now, called me a Chinese black nigger bastard. And no, I'm with you. You can laugh. It's as far as racial insults go, 10 out of 10 for originality. I mean, I've never heard that one before. And what's most fascinating about it is, like most people in Jamaica, like my great-great-grandmama does look like she's probably Chinese or half Chinese. There's a large Chinese Jamaican population. For those who do not know, they've been there for 200 years. They're still there today. When I was born, I did look like I had some Chinese ancestry, and it was much more pronounced when I was younger than it is today. So ironically, this little boy, who'd obviously been brainwashed by his parents, was picking up some colonial history, should we say, right? But looking back now, obviously at the time I was very, very angry. I look back now and I think, where does a 5-year-old even get that kind of vocabulary from? Like the level of child abuse involved in teaching your 5-year-old to go to school and deal with other children that way. And so obviously at the time I was angry at the boy, but I ran home and I went, Mummy, the white, and I went to say the white boy did. And I looked at her and I went, oh Mummy, you're white, aren't you? And she said, no, I'm German, they're English. My mum isn't German, I have no idea what possessed her to say that. She was just thinking on her feet. She was born in Dortmund, on the army base in Dortmund. So technically she was born in Germany, brought up in Hong Kong, but she's actually half Scottish, half English. She is in no way, other than the fact that English people are kind of cousins of Germans, she isn't German by ancestry at all. But I think what she was doing was trying to set up herself as not like the other people at school or whatever else, so I could feel comfortable telling her, what I was experiencing. But this experience, and obviously growing up in a mixed household, but in a household where my mother had not been treated very well by her own father, to put it mildly, specifically because she was in love with my dad, who was black, and my granddad didn't approve of that. It was very interesting growing up in that, and as I got older, trying to figure out if this is the way humans had always viewed the world. Politics always been filtered through the lens of race. And what's really, really fascinating to me about the myth of white racial superiority and racism is that it causes many people in Europe, even educated people, to lie to themselves about their own history. What do I mean by that? As I was doing some digging, trying to find out, is this the way the world's always been? And throughout my journey, I found out that the Kingdom of the Congo had an embassy in Italy and diplomatic relations with Rome in the 15th century. I found out that Aksumite Ethiopia in Africa was a diplomatic ally 1,000 years ago of the Byzantine Empire, because they were fellow Christians, they were both Orthodox Christians, and they were fighting against people of different religions throughout the world. I found out that Ethiopian scholars had been traveling to Italy for 600 or 700 years during the Middle Ages. Again, Ethiopia, it was called Aksum then, was a Christian kingdom, and they were exchanging theology and philosophy and so on, and there's some great Ethiopian books from that period. You can look up Ethiopian medieval churches like Lalibela and so on. And so ironically, racism causes people to deprive themselves of parts of the human story where people didn't always behave the way perhaps they behave today, and filter everything in the world through the lens of modern racial ideas, which in many senses are very, very new ideas. And that's, in a sense, my relationship with my mum, and realizing that the world saw my mum one way and me another way, caused me to go on this journey a little bit. Special needs. Now, this is me showing off a little bit. This is a novella I wrote when I was 10 years old. Actually, really is written by Kay McLean Daly. As you can see, it's about two young boys who, from a very troubled family, and they run away to Switzerland. As you can see, there is a Toblerone bar inside of Switzerland. Because, what else did I know about Switzerland other than it was cold and Toblerone? And let's be honest, if you came from a working class family, Toblerone was a very rare occurrence. It was the posh chocolate, the Christmas chocolate. You might get one square, right? So clearly, as you can see, I had a sweet tooth and I was obsessed with Toblerone. But I put this book up here because, sadly, the year before this, and it's a very, even now I will say this with absolutely a completely cynical lack of humility. I read the book back now and I go, oh my God, this kid was really quite fucking clever. I read it back and I'm like, I could write this now and it would still be kind of alright. I was surprised, to be honest, at how good I was at English when I was 9. I was very, very proud of myself, to be honest. In fact, I think on my Instagram I'll post a couple of the pages. And I say that to say this, despite that, despite being curious, despite being passionate about the world, in fact, perhaps because of it, despite the fact that I love school, the year before this, a teacher put me in a special needs group for kids who didn't speak English. And I was reading Lord of the Rings at home, so obviously I was confused. And they didn't tell my parents, obviously because my parents would have gone mad. But they gave us hot chocolate and biscuits, so obviously I wanted to stay in the group, right? I've got a sweet tooth, 2 molars missing, you know how it goes. But what I find cynical about this now that I'm older is I was being rewarded to fail. I was being incentivized to fail. And again, things happen to you in life, you try and find explanations as to why that happened. And on my research, I found that for a very, very long time in Britain, even before the large-scale migration of people from the Caribbean and Asia after the war, obviously there were black and brown people in long before that, before larger-scale migration, Britain had an education system that was very much designed to reproduce social class, right? Poor white children were taught fundamentally to have low expectations, and the high expectations were for posh people, and that you should know your place and know your station, and poor old white children who were bright or had too many opinions were often taken out of school and put in schools for the mentally subnormal. This was in less politically correct times around the turn of the 20th century, where the government was like, you're mentally subnormal, right? As an evolution of that, during my dad's generation, they had schools for the educationally subnormal. And again, these schools were not solely for black and brown children, but we found that, you know, West Indian children in particular, at the time it was West Indian children, were massively overrepresented in these schools for the educationally subnormal. So this wasn't just an experience that happened to me, it happened to David Onasoga, it happened to the journalist Simeon Brown, it happened to the film director Steve McQueen. There was a propensity in the schools for working class kids in general, but for black boys in particular, who had, you know, ideas above their station about where they should fit in the society, a little too much intellectual curiosity, to be basically siphoned off out of school and put into these special needs groups, even when they had absolutely no business being there. Luckily for me, this is me